I've seen arrogance before, but what walked into my courtroom that morning was something else entirely. The second she looked at me, I knew she thought the law was a joke. I had no idea when I opened that file that I was about to watch entitlement collapse in real time. Tell me something. Have you ever met someone who believed the rules didn't apply to them? Someone who thought their status put them above accountability? Because that's exactly what I was about to deal with. I've been sitting on the bench for 23 years. 23 years of listening to excuses, watching people lie to my face, and learning how to read the difference between someone who made a real mistake and someone who thinks they're smarter than the law. I didn't get to this courtroom because I'm easy on people. I got here because I don't let anyone hide. Not lawyers, not powerful people, not rich people, and especially not people who think money is the answer to every problem. My courtroom runs on one simple thing: respect, not for me personally, for the process, for the idea that the law is the same for everyone who walks through that door. I've always believed that if you let people talk long enough, the truth shows itself. I don't need to scream, I don't need to be dramatic. I just need to listen, watch, and ask the right questions. Most people crack under their own contradictions. They don't need much pressure from me, they do the work themselves. I come in every morning and I see the same patterns. I see people who are scared and trying to do the right thing. I see people who are defensive because they know they're wrong. I see people who are calculating, trying to figure out how much they can get away with. And I see people who have never in their entire life been told no. Those people are dangerous, not because they're violent, but because they don't understand that consequences exist. The one thing I cannot stand is disrespect. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care whose daughter you are or who your husband is. In my courtroom, you show respect to the process and to the people in it, or you're going to leave understanding that power doesn't protect you from the truth. I've never had patience for people who think status is an excuse. It's not. It actually makes things worse. That morning, I knew something was different about this case from the moment I read the file. A civil dispute, a contract, money owed. But there was something underneath that caught my attention. The defendant was listed as Margaret Ashford, wife of Governor William Ashford. I didn't care. I'd dealt with important people before. Money, power, connections, none of it changes how I do my job. But something told me this case was going to be more than just about money. The plaintiff walked in first. Her name was Elena Moreno. She was a small business owner, mid-50s, and I could see the exhaustion on her face the second she sat down. Not the exhaustion of being nervous in court, the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting for something for a long time and was running out of hope. She was wearing her best clothes, but they weren't expensive. I noticed her hands. She was holding her purse like it was grounding her. I've seen that before. It usually means someone is scared and working very hard not to show it. I looked at her file before we started. Elena owned a catering business. A family business, actually. She'd been hired 2 years ago to cater events at the governor's mansion. Regular events, fundraisers, private dinners, that kind of thing. The contract was clear. Payment within 30 days of each event over 2 years, according to her records. The mansion had hosted 37 events. The total amount owed was $218,000. She'd gotten paid for the first 15 events. Then the payments stopped. No explanation, no returned calls, just silence. Now here's what struck me about Elena's case right away. She had come alone, no lawyer. She'd tried to represent herself because she couldn't afford to hire someone, and the amount she was owed was probably all the money her family business had. This wasn't some person looking for a quick settlement. This was someone fighting for what belonged to her. I asked her to tell me what happened. You need to understand something about how I listen. I watch everything. Her face, her breathing, her pauses, where she looks when she answers. I watched Elena describe calling the mansion repeatedly. I watched her tell me about the emails she sent. I watched her voice steady itself when she talked about her family depending on that income. That was when I knew Elena was telling me the truth. The pain wasn't performed. It was real. She showed me the contract. It was solid, clean, professional. She had receipts for every event, photos of the food, the setup, invoices, everything. She was organized. She was prepared, and she was terrified. Elena told me that after she stopped getting paid, she'd kept catering those events for another 3 months before she finally had to stop. She was running out of money. She couldn't pay her staff. She couldn't cover her costs. So she'd sent one final invoice and asked for payment. That invoice said $218,000. She never got a response. I asked her if she'd ever spoken directly to Mrs. Ashford. Elena said no, she'd dealt with the mansion's event coordinator. When the payment stopped, that coordinator stopped returning her calls. Elena had left voicemails for the governor's wife directly, never heard back. I could see this had hurt Elena, not just financially. The disrespect of being ignored, of being treated like she didn't matter, of having her business ignored by someone powerful that mattered to her as much as the money. Do you understand what I saw in that moment? A person who played by the rules, a person who'd done the work, followed the contract, and was now watching someone with power pretend she didn't exist. That gets my attention every time. That was when the door opened and Margaret Ashford walked in. I knew it was her immediately. She came in with a lawyer on one side and an assistant. On the other, she was wearing designer clothes. Actually, everything about her broadcast money. The bag, the shoes, the way she held herself. She didn't sit quietly. She made an entrance. I watched how she moved into the courtroom. No nervousness, no sense that she needed to respect the space. She looked around like she was evaluating the room, like she was trying to figure out if this place was worth her time. Here's what I noticed right away. Margaret didn't look at Elena. Not once, not a glance, not even the kind of accident that happens when you're trying not to look at someone. Margaret looked at me, then at her lawyer, then at the walls. Elena was invisible to her. That told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. Margaret's lawyer stood up and started talking. He was smooth, professional. The kind of attorney who's used to winning because he's good at talking and his clients have money for appeals. He laid out their defense. According to him, the catering contract was not valid because it was never properly executed by an authorized representative of the mansion. He said the events coordinator had no authority to bind the governor's household to a financial agreement. Therefore, they had no legal obligation to pay. It was a technical argument. Clever, maybe. But I'd heard something in it that made me lean forward. He said the events coordinator had no authority. That meant they were saying someone who was clearly authorized, someone who scheduled the events, confirmed details, and supervised the work had somehow never been authorized to agree to payment. I asked him a simple question. I said, "Can you show me the evidence that this coordinator was informed she had no authority to agree to terms of payment?" He said they had documentation. Then I asked him another question. I said, "How would this business owner know that your employee had no authority if your household never informed her of that?" He didn't like that question. I could see it. He started talking about the legal principle of agency, about what someone should assume. I wasn't interested in his legal speeches. I wanted to know what actually happened. That was when I asked Margaret to speak. I said, "Mrs. Ashford, I'd like to hear directly from you about how this arrangement worked." She looked surprised, like she wasn't used to being asked direct questions. She looked at her lawyer. I held up my hand. I said, "I'm asking you, not your attorney." Margaret straightened up. She had this smile, like she found the whole thing slightly amusing. She said, "Your Honor, I'm not sure why my personal attention would be necessary. This is a business matter. These things are handled by staff." I kept my face neutral, but I was watching everything. I said, "Who is the staff member who told Miss Moreno she would be paid?" Margaret said, "Our event coordinator." Then she added, "But obviously they could not authorize payment of that amount." I said, "How is that obvious?" She said, "Because I never told them they could." I let the silence sit there for a moment. Then I said, "Did you ever tell Miss Moreno that your coordinator couldn't authorize payment?" She didn't answer right away. I watched her. Her lawyer started to interrupt, but I cut him off. I said, I'm waiting for Mrs. Ashford's answer. She said, that would be implicit. I said, implicit doesn't pay someone's bills. That was the moment the energy in the room shifted. Margaret's face changed. Not a lot, but I caught it. She wasn't used to not getting what she wanted. Here's what I want you to understand. At that moment, I knew what this case was really about. It wasn't about whether the contract was valid. It was about whether someone with power would take responsibility for what happened, or whether they would hide behind legal arguments and hope the other person would just go away. I've seen this before. Powerful people can usually afford to outlast everyone else. They can hire attorneys, file appeals, wait people out. Elena couldn't do any of that. She needed her money. I asked to see the contract again. I read it slowly, every line. Then I said to Margaret, this contract says the event coordinator would coordinate all aspects of the events, including payment terms. Is that correct? She said, that appears to be what it says. I said, did you ever tell Miss Marino that your coordinator didn't have authority to agree to those terms? She didn't answer. That was an answer. I said, did your coordinator ever tell Miss Marino that she didn't have authority to agree to payment? Again, silence. I said, so Miss Marino had a reasonable understanding, based on what your staff told her and what the contract said, that the terms were valid, correct? Margaret's lawyer jumped in. He said, Your Honor, we're not arguing that there was no understanding. We're arguing that the understanding was not legally binding because of lack of authority. I looked at him. I said, I understand your argument, but I'm asking your client if she believes it was reasonable for Miss Marino to expect payment based on how this arrangement was set up. He said again, Your Honor, I said, I'm asking Mrs. Ashford. Margaret said quietly, I would assume there was some misunderstanding. I said, a misunderstanding caused by your household, who created the system and hired the person who communicated the terms. I was watching her now, really watching her, her hands, her face, the way she was sitting. I'd seen confidence before. What I was looking at now was arrogance. There's a difference. Confidence is someone who knows they can handle something hard. Arrogance is someone who thinks hard things shouldn't apply to them. I told them both to sit down. I said I needed to review the evidence more carefully and I'd make a decision. I told them to come back in 2 weeks. Before they left, I watched Margaret. She stood up, straightened her clothes, and walked out without looking back. Still not a glance at Elena. Still nothing. Elena sat there for another moment, her hands still holding her purse. I called her over to the bench. I said quietly, Come here. She came up to the bench and I said to her, You did everything right. Everything. You have a legitimate contract and you did the work. That's not nothing. She thanked me. Then she left. I spent those 2 weeks reading through every document, every email, every invoice, every photo. And the more I read, the clearer it became. The mansion had accepted the service. The mansion had benefited from the service. The mansion had only stopped paying when Elena started making a fuss about the money she was owed. That's not a technical problem. That's a choice. When they came back to court 2 weeks later, I was ready. Margaret walked in the same way, same attitude, same like nothing was really at stake here for her. Elena came in quietly, sat down and waited. I said, I've read all the evidence. I've reviewed the contract and here's what I found. The contract between Elena Marino and the governor's household was valid. It was entered into by an authorized representative of the household who had been given the job of coordinating events, which includes negotiating the terms with vendors. You don't get to say someone has no authority to do a job you hired them to do and then use that as an excuse not to pay the person they contracted with. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, Second, the mansion received every service that was paid for by Elena Marino. You used her food. You used her staff. You benefited from her work. Now you want to say she should have known she wouldn't be paid. That's not how the law works. That's not how fairness works. I looked directly at Margaret. I said, You do not get to hurt people and then act insulted when consequences arrive. She shifted in her seat. I continued, I'm ordering the mansion, which means you, Mrs. Ashford, as the person responsible for household affairs to pay Elena Marino the full amount owed, $218,000. You will pay it within 30 days or you'll be in contempt of court. I saw her face. She wasn't smiling anymore. I said, and I want to say something else. I want the record to show that this case was delayed by the defendant's legal arguments about technicalities when the real issue was simple. Someone did work, someone deserved to be paid, and someone decided they didn't want to pay because they thought money and power would protect them from a basic debt. I leaned back in my chair. I said, let me tell you something about my courtroom. Money doesn't impress me. Status doesn't impress me. What impresses me is honesty and respect. What disappoints me is people who have everything and still want more by taking what belongs to someone else. This court is finished with this case. You are dismissed. Margaret's face had gone pale. Her lawyer was already talking, probably about an appeal, but I wasn't listening. I was looking at Elena. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she was smiling. That's the thing about justice. When it finally shows up, people know it. Margaret's people filed an appeal. They claimed I'd misinterpreted the contract. They claimed I'd shown bias. They claimed all kinds of things. But the appellate court read the same contract and came to the same conclusion. The ruling stood. The payment was made. What happened after is what really matters. Elena told me later that the payment came through almost immediately. Turns out the governor's household didn't want an extended legal battle. They wanted this to go away. They got the message that I wasn't going to let them ignore someone smaller than they were. Elena told me she used the money to hire a lawyer for her next contracts. She made sure her agreements were ironclad. She made sure everyone signed off directly. She was done relying on handshakes and the assumption that people would do the right thing. I don't know if Margaret learned anything. I doubt it. People like that usually don't. They experience consequences and then they find new ways to do the same thing. That's what I've learned. Entitlement doesn't change because someone loses a court case. It changes because someone finally tells it no and it has to listen. But here's what I know for certain. In my courtroom that day, someone was heard who thought no one would listen. Someone got justice when she thought she'd be ignored forever. Someone learned that the law is still the law, even when you're married to someone important. That's why I still believe truth matters. Do you?